everyone. Welcome back to the Face to Face podcast. This is our first episode of season 2, and I'm Jerry.
I'm Teddy, and this is our guest, Dr. Smith.
So today, our other hosts couldn't be here, so we only have 2 people. But shifting to Dr. Smith, we know that you teach American government, U.S. history, and bioethics at Burroughs, and you've been here for a while. And
previous century, in fact.
Yeah. So, is there anything that you wanted to tell us before we start?
No, excited to be here. Thanks for having me. Appreciated the invitation. I had my daughter check you guys out, and she watched the Wagner episode, and she approved. So here I am. Yeah, I had my people look into it.
About history, we were curious, going into your teaching. Is there a certain history topic or unit that you teach that you're especially love teaching or super interested in?
My graduate work was in the early national period for the United States, but I think any success I've had here is based on trying to take anything I teach and make it fun and interesting to me, because if it's not that for me, then it won't be for you.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a favorite, because that would suggest something else has gone wrong in the process.
Yeah, I can attest to that, because when I had you in 8th grade, every class was super interesting, because we would have a lot of discussions about the topic. It was a great class to come to. I look forward to going to it every day.
Maybe we'll get to dance again one day.
Yeah.
So as a teacher, I'm sure you've taught many students in many classes. Have there been any?
He's my favorite.
Have there been any favorite teaching moments you've had, or favorite classes?
I mean, they all probably fall under the same umbrella, which is, the reason we get into this is because you want to help people grow and develop. You want to help them explain things. Those moments when a student sees a connection for the first time, the moment when someone who's been struggling grasps the concept, that's what makes you want to come back the next day and do it again.
Yeah, that's great. So we're curious about just history in general, or I don't know.
Me too.
But we were wondering if you could witness any historical event firsthand, which one would it be and why? Because I feel that's a very loaded question.
Good gracious, yeah.
Do a bunch of different things, moral or interest, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? Because there's so many things you would want to see. Do you want to see something momentous? Do you want to see something quiet? I mean, do I get to interact, or do I just have to watch it happen? Can I just haunt Monticello and follow Thomas Jefferson around for the day, or do I do I get to be in the crowd for the Declaration of Independence signing? What do you?
I think maybe another thing that just watching could be one part of the question, but also what about changing something in an event in history,
or even interact? Because when I heard the question, I was thinking I would be interested to talk to someone.
Yeah.
Like one of the greatest thinkers or something like that,
sure.
Newton or Einstein. I feel that would be, I don't know, just I feel talking to someone helps you learn how they think,
Sure. I mean, obviously in history there's lots of mysteries or lots of riddles that we talk with. You think of someone like Jefferson, someone like Lincoln, these enigmas that you really want to say, well, historians have said a lot of things about you. What were you thinking about when you did this? What did you think the limitations were on you? And trying to get to know an individual better, I think, would probably be the thing. But to your question about what would I change? I mean, you would want to try to alleviate human suffering in some way, right? Mm-hmm. So going selectively through history and figuring out ways to eliminate people who caused millions of people to suffer and die, right? I mean, you'd have a long list of people you could take out.
Yeah.
I think maybe we should transition.
Yeah, we should. I think we could go into a more fun segment.
Okay.
What? And
talking the philosophy of history isn't fun? Jeez, guys.
A little bit more lighthearted. Well, actually, I wouldn't say lighthearted.
I don't know.
Yeah, you were going to start killing people here. That's,
yeah.
Okay. Your version of lighthearted is kind of fun.
I think everyone knows the famous trolley problem.
Yeah.
But if you don't, the famous trolley problem is there's a track and a trolley's coming towards, and it's going to run a person over. and you're witnessing
Five
this.
people.
Oh, yeah, going to run 5 people over. Sorry. And you're witnessing it, and there's a lever that you can pull to divert the track to run over one person. So you pull the lever, or do you leave it be?
Yeah. And so we thought that since, well, this obviously doesn't have as much to do with history, but since you're also a bioethics teacher,
Sure.
And we thought it would be interesting discussions for like these kinds of, I guess, a moral dilemma, you could call it. So we were wondering, like, what was your take on a question
Well,
like that?
it's something I teach because it's a great thing for seniors to be able to wrap their minds around pretty early in bioethics because they've never had a philosophy course before. So getting them attuned to the way in which we try to think in philosophy, what ethical principles are, and what you're going to value has great meaning for us really early in the year. So you know the sort of the two schools of thought are: should you be utilitarian, right? I'm get back to the human suffering thing, right? Am I going to try to eliminate as much human suffering as possible, or minimize the suffering? In which case, you pull the lever and you kill the one person. The other side would be that, like, you know, if you're more of an intentional based person and say, oh, look, you know, my intentions have to be pure. I can't intentionally act to kill someone. You would say, okay, well, this is a bad situation. I really have nothing to do with it. You know, I'm gonna let the 5 die. I'm more on the utilitarian side of things. So you try to pull that lever. I mean, there are lots of permutations of the trolley problem, and they all sort of try to get you to isolate different things. But in the end, it's vaguely utilitarian in each of its incarnations to say, what are you willing to do, and how are you willing to do it? How much pain and suffering are you willing to cause or avoid? Yeah,
I think that like me personally, I do think I would lean towards pulling the lever. Like, obviously, in this situation, it's super difficult, super stressful, but like whatever. But like I don't know. I feel like I do also lean more utilitarian. But I think you're different. Right?
I haven't thought about this that much, but I have, like, you know, we've discussed it as a group, and I've thought about it too. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I would pull it. Mainly because in my view, I think pulling it, even though letting it go would kind of be like watching murder, I guess. But in my opinion, like, pulling it is kind of like really
committing
it, and also like changing, what was supposed to happen. Which is complicated.
What is supposed to happen?
Yeah, because if you
but those two pieces are the horns of this dilemma, right? I mean, that's what is our responsibility to others? What's our responsibility to society? What's our responsibilities to ourselves? And those are all things that, you know, it's great to be able to wrestle with at 8:30 in the morning, first period for bioethics.
Yeah, and I guess so. Developing on that, since you and Teddy both said that you would pull it, what if? So I was wondering, like, does the number matter? Because so what if you pulled it, instead of killing one person, it's killing 4?
4 versus 5.
4 versus 5.
Like, you pull to kill 4.
I mean, again,
it's the same idea.
It's so utilitarian, right?
Yes, and I mean, like, we got like these 2 problems from like some website called like Neil.com or something like that. And it also has statistics, right? So for the first one, the original trolley problem, 73% of people pull the lever. So you fall kind of out of the majority.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what would you do if we changed the numbers on you when it was 1 in 10?
Yeah.
1 in 20, 1 in 1,000.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
I mean, is there some number where you would say, I've reached my limit, I can't do that?
Yeah, I actually thought about that too, and we were also talking about that. And I think for my argument, I think the number does matter because
so 5 just doesn't do it.
I think it's kind of like harsh to say, I guess, but I think like there's like a level of responsibility you feel, and the number could outweigh it if it gets big enough, if that makes sense.
And where's your number? 10?
It's really difficult when you get into bigger numbers because it gets hard. I mean, like, the famous Joseph Stalin said, 1 death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Yeah. So like it's hard to really imagine when you get into those big numbers, like what that really
Oh, right, but I
means.
mean, again, but that's philosophy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we do love our thought experiments, right? Because they're trying to illuminate some principle that we're driving at in some other way. Like we like to argue from analogy. Like, oh, if you believe this, then in this situation, you would probably believe this. Wait a minute, that's abhorrent. Oh, so why are you believing what you believe there?
Yeah.
I mean, this is what we do. We try to poke and prod at your beliefs, trying to make sure you know what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah. So when it's like gets down to the number thing, then my argument seems a little bit less consistent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard.
Is that wrong?
That's the issue with ethics. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I think it still goes both ways, but I don't know. I think it's another thing about it is like how much you value like a human life. Obviously, you'd value somebody close to you more than somebody that you don't know.
But should
And yeah, that's another question. And so I don't know. It could also just be like a subconscious like way of approaching it, where maybe 5 people is different than 100 people, and then you kind of just weigh the responsibility versus the number, kind of just without even like intentionally thinking about it. If that makes sense.
I mean, I think in one respect, ethics could be seen as a rational process that we would like to, we're sitting here in a very, very comfortable environment with drinking our sponsored bottled water. If we were in the situation and you have to react without thinking, or you have to react in an emotional way, to what extent is that going to cloud your judgment? Like we can sit here and say, right, of course I would do this, but given the situation,
did you really?
Would you actually? I mean, there's some interesting research that suggests the more you think of these things, the more you sort of practice doing ethics, the more ethical you will live your life, because your subconscious just gets that tuning, right? I mean, like whatever sport you play, right? You just keep doing it until the muscle memory takes over. Is ethics like a muscle that you can just practice? And hopefully, when the situation arises, if you ever are confronted with a trolley,
would you pull that?
You stick with your idea.
What to do,
yeah. I mean, I guess kind of building on that, and then we'll go right back to the game. But would you say that if you're thinking and practicing ethics more, it's hard to like get better at it. But would you say you get less bad? Yeah. Right. I mean,
I feel like the more you discuss it, the less like closed-minded you get.
Yeah. Maybe you can process more sides.
And the goal is obviously to lead an ethical life, right? I mean, and so the more you think about these things, the more perspectives you can take in, the more information you can do. Hopefully your thought process leads you to a more defendable position, and you don't just act out of self-interest all the time.
Yeah. Like kind of transitioning to a more like object versus human and less like human v human. One of the other situations it gave us, which was one of the closest, like it was like one of the most split decisions, percentage wise. It was the trolley's heading towards a rich man, and if you pull the lever, it will head towards like just some average person.
One guy.
But the rich man is offering you $500,000 to pull that lever. He says, if you pull that lever and you save my life, I'll give you $500,000.
So it's one-on-one.
Plus 500,000.
I now have financial.
So it's like the issue between, is $500,000 worth more than committing that act?
So if I pull the lever, I kill the.
You kill the average person and gain $500,000.
Oh well, then you don't pull the lever, right? Because I mean, it's a one-on-one situation, and I'm not in the murder for hire business.
That's how I feel about it. But like 47% of people pull that lever
and kill the
based off this website. So like that's still like that's a lot of people. It's very close.
Yeah.
Out of 6.6 million votes.
I mean, look,
it's easy to click a button on a website.
Easy to click a button on a website, and it's a silly amount of money, but can we all be bought for just a different amount of money? Like if it's John Bang on one side of the website and a chocolate chip cookie, then sure, I'll take the cookie and kill Bang. But it totally depends on every person's line, I suppose.
Yeah. So obviously, with my argument, I would leave it. because I mean, the materialistic like values is not higher than what I was saying at first. But so I'm wondering, like, what could you make the argument if it's utilitarianism? If it's still one against one, could you make an argument that like maybe the $500,000 could be put to good use or something like that, to like helping if you have it? Does that make sense?
Oh, I mean, you can argue whatever you want to argue, right? I mean, are you going to promise to donate it to charity? Are you going to give it to the family of the guy you just killed? You're still doing an act for money in my mind. So that would,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that would eliminate that as a possibility.
But going more into like, I don't know, your view on ethics. So like you teach bioethics,
I do.
and like we were wondering, like in that class or maybe just in general, like what's your favorite ethical question, or ethical question that you have to ask your students, or something like that?
I mean, it's the same answer I gave you earlier, which is that because it's not a full-on philosophy class, right?
Mhm.
Where I have to fill stuff for the whole year. It's like it's half me, half Deacon. So really, I just get to narrow down like the best things. So I've gone through and picked things like the trolley game to be able. We don't play this game, but we certainly do that. Well, maybe we should. But to ask like the greatest questions of philosophy. If push came to shove, it would be about who you are, and because I think that's really the sole goal of life, is to try to figure that out for yourself. And so the more I can get kids to think about that and give them, well, here's some what other people have said on this, and here's some ways for you to think about this. Those days are always fun, but bioethics is a great class, and people who take it want to be there, and so they want to wrestle with these issues. Like if it was a required class and I was forcing you to think about philosophy, you might not like that, but it's a self-selecting group, and we've been fortunate over the years that we've had some really good students who wanted to wrestle with some of this stuff at a really early age before they get to college and might want to take an intro to philosophy class.
Yeah, I actually heard about like the "Who are you?" question from Mr. Walker, who took the class.
Yeah.
And he said like it was like probably one of the most difficult questions he's ever had to like try and answer, but also like one of the most rewarding.
Well, I mean, it's not one you need to answer definitively at any one period of time, because you're constantly changing and evolving and growing in ways that you should always be asking yourself, that question. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And is this consistent with who I think I am and who I want to be? That's, if there's a goal to life, I guess it's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's a great goal.
I think another part of ethics is also like government and society.
Sure.
The ethical values that a government has, and so there are stricter governments with more, I guess you could say, security, less freedom of either expression or just like privacy, things like that. There's also freer governments.
Sure.
So I think I could argue that the U.S. is on the freer side for governments in the world today. And, sometimes for the freer governments, you have to sacrifice some things to, give the people those rights. And then for the stricter governments, you have to sacrifice some things to give people more security sometimes. And so we were just wondering, do you think there's any, obviously it's not black and white, but do you think there's any like balance of those two government types, and also like what's the best way of executing those kinds of things, if that makes sense?
If I knew that, I'd run my own country. Ben Franklin, I think, said that those who would sacrifice essential freedom for extra security, deserve neither freedom or security. Or I probably butchered that quote, but you can go with it.
Mm-hmm.
And life and government and lawmaking is about a balancing act, right? And these things we talked about in 8th grade.
Yeah.
And I think about when we did it during COVID, right? We did it at a time when we wanted our government to keep us safe, and yet we wanted to still have our freedom. So I think it's a very delicate balancing act, and I don't think there's any one line at any one time, right? living through COVID is certainly presents a set of challenges to a government. Living in a time period of war would be another one. Living in a time period of total peace or of climate endangerment, right? So I mean, I think there aren't good answers, and I think not only do you see other countries through the world doing things differently, they do things differently because they're different cultures and they have different histories and different paths, and they come with different ideological baggage than we do. We were a country born in freedom, so we say, but we were also a country that enslaved at the same time, right? So that we created our notion of freedom, interestingly, at the same time. The people who were doing it were slave owners, and the British pointed that out. And one member of Parliament asked, "Why is it that we hear the loudest cries for liberty from the drivers of slaves?" Right? I mean, that's that they understood. Oh, this is what freedom is, and this is what it isn't. So there's no easy answer there, but it's one that you really have to constantly be willing to change the dials, because as one goes up, as you said, the other goes down. And there isn't like one magical setting that will be human flourishing, right? I mean, the state needs to protect us from ourselves sometimes. The state needs to protect us from each other at times, and yet the state wants us, hopefully, to flourish. And so I have to give you freedom to do that. So it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, I remember last year in Mr. Wagner's class, we were learning about like legalism in China. And so this kind of concept was brought up, and he showed us an article comparing Singapore, which is a stricter government with more safety, versus the US. And I remember he was saying that everybody wants more rights. Everybody wants more freedom to, express themselves.
As long as you express yourself the way I want you to.
Yeah. But nobody, wants to be controlled. Everybody would have the preference of, having more individuality and being able to have freedom. And then he was saying, until you're the family where the police comes to your door and says that, I don't know, a family member was killed or something like that. And in a situation like that, then, that trade-off doesn't seem as worth it. And so I thought it was just a really interesting idea, and I wanted to
it gets back to our trolley problem discussion, right? Which one, I don't know if that was on the list, but like, if the one person you're going to kill is your best friend, the one person you're going to kill is your spouse, do you still hold to all your principles, or where do we value that? And again, it's hard to be able to say, I'm always going to act in my self-interest versus I'm always going to think of the greater good, and how, the greater good is made up of a collection of self-interests, right? Or some type of larger construct there. I don't have an answer for you. It's again, one of those very tricky questions, but it's great to talk it through.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. Because especially looking at a government like China, I heard this statistic a while back. I don't know how accurate it is, but something. In certain parts of China, they have cameras all over the place.
Yeah, in larger cities.
Yeah, and I heard a statistic saying they can find any person in those larger cities within 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Anyone they need to within if they committed a crime, they're we found you. So obviously it makes it a lot safer, but there's an element of privacy to that.
I mean, privacy is a fascinating concept. I think I'm of a certain age where I see it differently than you do. To get back to the phones, and you guys are probably on your phone or on social media sharing things much more than I ever would be comfortable for. It just wasn't the time I was raised in.
Yeah.
So the culture is certainly shifting there, but that kind of state oversight, don't think it would go over real well here. I mean, think of when the NSA. When we learned that they were listening into a whole bunch of phone calls,
people got really mad.
They're really mad because here we value that privacy a little more than people. If you were never raised with the concept of privacy, that might not bother you, right? If you were raised to think collectively, we need to do this more than you need to be anonymous, then it probably wouldn't bother you as much because you weren't raised in that set of principles.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on the values that a society has, and that's why it's hard to there's no right or wrong answer, because it really just depends on how the people view it, and also what works in different places won't work in another place. So yeah, it's an
I
interesting.
mean, I don't want to be too much of a cultural relativist. I mean, I do believe there's some universal principles, but on things like privacy and cameras, you might just have to say, I wasn't raised that way, and they are, so we're just different in that respect. If we get into more, overtly evil practices, we may wish to draw some lines.
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, Bioethics, just the other day we were talking about China has mobile transplant units that will go prison to prison, and I sentence you to death, we shoot you in the head, and 2 seconds later you're in a van and he's taking out your organs and we're passing them around. Right? I mean, it's something that we would say to ourselves, whoa, hey, I don't think we're comfortable doing that, but we have a massive organ shortage, and they've solved that problem in one respect, but they're putting more people to death for lesser crimes just to be able to get organs, and that seems problematic.
Seems very utilitarian.
In
a way, I feel like
organ donation, surely. Right, like it's a big box of Legos, and put the Lego back in and make something else tomorrow. Right, I mean I get that part of it.
But I mean,
but like if I'm killing you for your organs, again we can draw some lines.
It's very complicated. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in any respect at all. Especially when looking at like governments that exist in our society. Like I feel like it's very, very difficult to say like this one's wrong, this one's right.
Well, I mean, it gets back to the question we were asking about history later or earlier. To what extent are you willing to look at a different society in the past or now and say, okay, you guys are doing that thing, right? It's not what we're doing, doesn't make it right or wrong, but you're a manifestation of what you're attempting to accomplish, and we're doing something else. You think about that in families or in friend groups or whatever else the case may be, and if you try to understand people at that level, we might just all get along a little better.
Maybe. I think I do think that closed-mindedness is like definitely like something that like people could work on, like just trying to understand more about people who are different,
more understanding, less judging,
who are different.
would be.
But obviously, that's really easy for me to just sit there and say.
We will judge those people who don't understand.
Exactly.
But social media doesn't help.
Not at all.
In that regard.
Because you see something on social media, like instantly you're gonna think things about that person. Like you're like, okay, this. Because exactly. Going back to like more broader, more societal, but like in the U.S. Do you have any thoughts about the U.S. in like the future? Based on like how our society is like or like do you think like we're
my crystal ball broke years ago.
Well, I guess what we're trying to say is like we know that you teach U.S. government, you teach U.S. history, and also just studying history in general. We know that there are patterns that you can see from history. It's not always the exact same, but
I mean, as I say probably on the first day of our history class, that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Right? We see similar themes coming up over and over again, and history again is about the context, and the context is always different, which is why it doesn't repeat itself. But issues crop up from time to time in America. The pendulum of where we put power in a society. Do we want to put it more in the central government? Do we want to push it off to the peripheries? That's something that has, it's a defining question for us, and it's been there since the beginning. So, you do get to revisit these things from time to time, and we're certainly in a fragile time in our country's history. We're in a very contentious political time in our country's history, but we've had those problems before, and we're still here, right? I mean, are we going to be here for another 100 years, 500 years? I have no idea. Histories of the future are notorious for being wildly inaccurate because you can't possibly know what's coming, right? I mean, I'm going to the grocery store after this. I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to buy, but not entirely sure. Let alone who's going to win an election in the fall. Tell me what the economy is doing. Tell me what everything else is doing, and I'll give you a better guess. But thinking about the future is fun, but actually getting to predict it, that's a little more challenging.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. I think. Well, you did say that like this we're in fragile times now.
Yeah.
And that it has happened before. I was just wondering, like, could you think of like any times? And I want to like think about how similar they are, because I don't know. I feel like obviously it's a lot harder said done. It's easier said than done, but I feel like looking at patterns from the past can definitely like help you see a little bit, even just like an outline of what could happen in the future.
Fair.
So I was just wondering, do you have any examples?
You wonder if this time period is more akin to the 1960s, a time period of great political and cultural upheaval where it seemed that society was fraying. The fabric that holds us together, the tapestry of America, was really coming apart at the seams. Or is it more like 100 years before that in the Civil War, where we are so far down the path
Fighting each other.
that I mean, we hope it doesn't come to that, but if one political candidate loses in the fall and says, no, that election was not legitimate, and my side is willing to take up arms or leave the country or do whatever, then all of a sudden a whole series of cascading events can quickly come to mind, right? I mean, like the people in the late 1850s weren't generally thinking, oh, of course there's going to be a civil war.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we know looking back, oh gosh, here it comes. But walking into it, they don't know that's going to be the case. They certainly don't know it's going to be a 5-year cataclysmic war.
Yeah.
What is going to happen in this upcoming election? I don't know. But I'm going to enjoy watching.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, I'm a government teacher, right? I mean, it's a terrible time to be a citizen, but be a government teacher. They just keep giving me things to talk about.
Those people, like, they also, like, they had no clue that, like, even when that war happened, that it would lead to such a massive change in history. Like, you could possibly even argue that that war was completely justifiable, right? So, like, because to get rid of slavery, right?
I mean, like, as we'll talk about next year, right? The war might not start that way. The war becomes about that. I think it probably starts with Lincoln saying, you don't get to leave the Union just because you don't like the outcome of an election, right? And over time, he realizes to put the country back together, I might have to end slavery. And then he sort of becomes more set in his ways as time goes on. But like watching his evolution through that, I mean, he starts the war by saying, if I could save the Union by freeing all, some, or none of the slaves, I'll do it.
Yeah.
He seems to care deeply about the country, and later changes his mind. And like we like to think of him at the, oh yes, of course he was heroic and moving forward and going to end slavery, right? This was a crusade.
Yeah.
Well, as we dig in closer, it's things are more gray than that.
So we talked a little about the 20th century, and they told me not to ask this, but
but you're gonna do it anyway.
I'm so curious. So I recently wrote my term paper on socialism, or like the rise of socialism.
Sure.
In class, we're also learning, touching a bit on like nationalism, like ideas like those. And I was just wondering, so we know a lot about the 20th century. There were so many events, like so many things happened, so many arguably like evil regimes or like, that caused a lot of suffering. So you could say, obviously Nazi Germany, you could argue for like the Cultural Revolution in China, the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Pol Pot.
And
right? We got... There's a whole bunch of...
There's a lot of stuff that happened in the last century. And so, and of course, every century is packed. We do know a lot more about this one because... there's a recency bias, right? We've lived through it. I mean, there is an argument that we're moving generally safer over time, that violence is declining over time. The people are not being as awful to each other. Yeah. And so my question was, do you think a lot of those things are kind of caused by like these ideas that are rising, or are those things just like kind of courses in history that would just naturally happen? Like that kind of a regime will just arise, and then in the future.
Yeah, I mean, is it human nature, in other words, that we want this quest for power, and that if we were to go back in history, we would find all sorts of people attempting to project their power over others in a way.
Yeah.
I think there's
so.
there's sadly something to that in terms of humanity, right? I mean, I think we have this. Our great big brains are wonderful sorting machines, and they sort us into friend and foe, and they sort us into this is my tribe and this is not my tribe, and you know, I must go conquer the other tribe for their resources because they threaten me, or the way they look, or whatever the case is. So I think if we went through any century, we'd find problems like you described, maybe not on the magnitude. I think the 20th century has a larger population. We've industrialized in ways that we can do some of these killings more efficiently.
Yeah,
Yay us.
I feel like you can find it happening like every time. The motives are probably different each time, but in the end, it's large power trying to conquer a crap ton of land.
For resources, for power, for whatever the case may be.
So in the 20th century, what do you think like the big ideas driving? Because the reason why I brought it up is because I thought that like especially Soviet Union and China were pretty similar in kind of structure, also with like the socialism thing that I studied. And so I was just wondering, do you think there are any common ideas that drove a bunch of different places of the world?
I mean, socialism and capitalism would be two really good ones. I mean, socialism briefly shows up here in the United States. It's undone by a whole host of things, right? It's undone by American nativistic sentiment, right? The socialists are coming in; they're foreigners. I don't want to deal with that. It's undone by American class problems. It's undone by American race problems, right? The notion that we should see all workers together as one runs into men who don't want women to take their jobs, whites who don't want blacks to take their jobs. Skilled workers don't want to be in the same union as unskilled workers, right? We have too many issues going on for socialism ever really to take off here. Also, we didn't have a feudal past in ways that some of those other places did, so that there aren't those long-standing things, right? We're sort of formed as a capitalist enterprise, and that sort of seems to be in the nation's DNA. But I think if you look at let's say the middle of the 20th century, when you do get into the Cold War, a lot of things that were driving that were that battle of politics over, should the world look more like the socialist model? Should it look more like the liberal capitalist model? So those would be the two sort of competing ideas that dominate at least the latter half of the 20th century.
And then moving to World War II, it's very different, I feel like, because it's like.
Well, I mean, it's genocide, but it's also territorial grabs, right? And it's really the territorial stuff that's going to start it.
Yeah, like just
and then the quest to stop genocide. But that doesn't mean the U.S. doesn't. I don't think the U.S. finds its first concentration camp until November of '44. So that there were certainly rumors that come out, and there was some things that made it to the State Department. But the United States is just, I'm going to win the war, and the ethical principles that show up there is like, what's the best way to help the folks who are in those camps? Is it to end the war as quick as you can, and then track the camps down, or is it to go wander in the countryside and find the camps? It's not like we know where they are, right? We have some ideas, but what are you willing to do, and how are you willing to do it? Are great questions.
So going like back into like more ethics sides, we were wondering about like modern ethical problems, and obviously like
there are a lot of moral problems.
Yes, there are.
Now that you know, they're like two-sided arguments. It's not just
it's not
right
just
or
one side.
wrong. Obviously, nothing is.
And we were wanting to
black or white.
discuss like both sides, not like take a side in a manner, but just like discuss both sides of the argument. Like, I don't know if there's like what I was talking about before. If there's people who are like closed-minded about these topics, just discuss both sides. Like, give both sides a chance to, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have. It's incumbent upon you to try to do that. I mean, we're a democracy, right? So what we want is for you to be able to tackle these ideas, for you to be able to take them in, hold two opposing ideas in your head at one time, and say, this is what I'm going to believe, and this is why I'm going to believe it.
Yeah.
And again, reasonable people can disagree on some of these issues, but trying to rule a pluralistic society through a democratic process, as we're finding out, is increasingly challenging.
Mm-hmm. I feel like earlier, this
You
is
can
so
transition
bad.
again.
So, like earlier, when we were talking about the trolley problem, I brought up the Joseph Stalin quote. Like, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. And I was wondering, like, do you have a favorite quote? Because my world tip teacher, Mr. Nicholas, he brings up this quote like all the time. He really likes it, and I think it's a great quote. So it's become like my favorite quote. Is that like, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. I was wondering if we
was it blocking the clock when he?
Yeah. I was wondering if we could like wrap it up with like, what do you think you're like? Would you have like a favorite quote?
I saw that on the sheet, and I said to myself, hundreds, right?
Mm-hmm.
I used to have a different classroom, and I would put a different quote on the board a week, and you could walk by and see it. So I have a file of them all. But just this morning, just before I came here, I learned that the coach of the University of Maryland basketball program when I was growing up, a guy named Lefty Driesell, just died. I went to his basketball camp when I was an 8th grader, and like he was a godlike figure. Problematic in certain ways, but my favorite quote of his, which I'll leave you with, since I even busted out my Maryland socks for Lefty today, was, "I may not know my X's and O's, but I can coach." Right, and there was something just brilliant about that. That it does. It's not necessarily, coaching is more than this. We're all more than the sum of our parts, and the way in which we try to be something doesn't have to fit sort of one cookie cutter mold. So I'll leave you with Lefty Driesell.
Yeah, good quote.
All right, I guess we can wrap
That's
up.
a good way to wrap up.
Dr. Smith, this was a really interesting discussion.
Thanks,
we were kind
guys.
of going all over the place, but we talked about like history. We played the trolley game.
Yeah.
And then we were going into like ethics and also some other pretty vague questions towards the end. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed it. I felt like talking about closed-mindedness, I feel like my mind was open to new things, and like I feel like I learned a lot. So, and I hope people who are listening in did too. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who's listening. Whatever.
Still going.
All
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.